My name is Caroline Cox. I'm the chair of Hourglass. We're hosting the webinar today when we will be discussing what we can do to prevent predatory marriage and perhaps learn some more about it. Certainly, I've only become aware of this in the last few years in terms of older people and adults with learning disabilities in particular. Clearly knew about it in a cultural way, but not in these two areas. We're going today to introduce the other panel members. Then Daphne, who has a particular experience of this issue, will give a presentation with slides. We will all be able to ask questions of her after that. And then we will discuss 4 questions that we've already received amongst the panel. But if you, as the participants or the people joining the webinar today, have a question that you'd like to ask, if you could do so through the, I'm looking at the bottom of my screen, the question and answer facility at the bottom of your screen, then Penny, who works for Hourglass, will let us know. Oh, there you are, there she is. Hello, Penny. Will let us know, and we will incorporate those questions into our discussions. So I think without further ado, I will ask people to introduce themselves. We'll try and stay to the same time, but it may just go over. And so that people know this is being recorded and it will be available on Hourglass website and maybe elsewhere. I think Penny will be able to tell me during this course of this where it will be available. Daphne, can I ask you to introduce yourself, please?
Hello, I'm Daphne Franks. I'm a university teacher. I teach at Leeds Medical School and elsewhere. I teach communication skills and other non-clinical courses. I'm not a doctor, I'm a teacher. And part of our course is a little bit of safeguarding, but even that was not enough to prevent my mum from having a predatory marriage back in 2015. I'm going to give a talk in a moment, and it's a much shortened version of my talk. If by any chance you would like me to give a longer version of my talk to your organisation, do please get in touch. I'm happy to talk to groups of any size. Thank you very much.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you, Daphne. Fabian, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yes, thank you, Caroline. I'm Fabian Hamilton. I'm the Labour Member of Parliament for Leeds North East. I'm also Shadow Minister in the Foreign Office covering peace, disarmament and Latin America. I first met Daphne when she came to see me at my advice surgery when she lived in my constituency, and she told me this horrifying story about her mother, of which a little bit more later. I've been married for 42 years. I have 3 grown-up children and 2 small grandsons.
Lovely, thank you. Andrew.
Yeah, I'm Andrew Bishop. I'm a senior associate solicitor at Shoosmiths. I specialise in all forms of contentious probate and inheritance disputes, sort of hence why myself and our firm have sort of teamed up with Fabian and Daphne about this concept, and we're trying to obviously promote change and protect the vulnerable and the sort of sanctity of marriage.
Lovely, thank you. We were going to be joined today by Rachel Clausen, who is an associate professor of social work at the University of Nottingham, who has done a lot of work around and has expertise around forced marriage with people with learning disabilities and predatory marriage of older vulnerable adults. Daphne has done a lot of work with Rachel, so we'll be able to, I think, answer any questions that Rachel may have done. Also, we will take questions and we will go back to Rachel. Sadly, Rachel has COVID and is not feeling well enough to join us. She did try. So if she is joining us in secret, then welcome, Rachel. I hope you get better soon. Okay, Daphne, would you like to start your presentation? We're looking forward to it.
Thank you very much. I'll just share my screen. Caroline, I'd be grateful if you could let me know when you can see
I will do.
my slides. Can you see that?
No, I can't. Can anybody else? No?
Right, let's try again. Oh, it worked so well in the rehearsal.
It really
These things
did.
always do.
It really did. There you go.
Got it.
There you go. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
Fabulous.
Now. Yep. Thank you.
This webinar is about predatory marriage, which is usually defined as the practice of marrying an elderly person exclusively for the purpose of gaining access to their estate upon their death. And the term came from Canada originally. I'd like to broaden that to marrying someone for your own purposes, because as we'll see, there's a lot of overlap with gaslighting and with grooming and with coercive control. This is my mother, Joan Blass. My mother, Joan Blass, died at home on Saturday, March the 26th, 2016. She was nearly 92 with advanced vascular dementia and terminal cancer. The day she died was Easter Saturday. Everything was quiet over the Easter weekend. And then when everything opened up again on Easter Tuesday, I got a phone call from my mum's GP. He sounded worried. He said, "Daphne, did you know your mother was married?" And that was when the bottom dropped out of our world, because we had seen it coming and not been able to do a thing about it. My mother died on Easter Saturday. On Easter Tuesday, Ranlin arrived at the GP surgery with a marriage certificate. His name is not Ranlin or anything like it. I never name him for two reasons. One, he hasn't been prosecuted, although the police did try very hard to prosecute him. There was not enough in place, which we'll come to later. And the other thing is, for me, this is not about him. This is about my mum. My mum was not fit to marry because of her dementia. She shouldn't have been allowed to marry him if he'd have been George Clooney or Clark Gable or anyone like that. He had married her on the 26th of October, 2015. The witnesses were his son and a lady from the pub. None of my mother's family or friends was present, and none of them knew the wedding was planned or that it had taken place. My mother had a 5-year history of vascular dementia, referred to repeatedly throughout her medical records, and I have a copy of those. We couldn't believe it, so we set out about trying to find out how the marriage could possibly have taken place. And just to spool back a bit, here are my parents, Ron and Joan Blass. My dad, Ron, was from a very poor background. He was born in the slums of Leeds and he was Jewish. Very unusual to have a mixed marriage in those days, but they were happy. He worked very hard and became a pharmacist. My mother was from Barrow-in-Furness, again from a poor background. She was a bit of a sporting genius at school, and she was being coached for the Olympics in Barrow-in-Furness swimming pool. But sadly, Adolf Hitler put a stop to those hopes by the simple method of dropping a bomb on it. But she was also very academic, and she got the one scholarship from the Northwest to Leeds University, which is where she met my dad. And at Leeds University, she edited the Griffin newspaper, which is still going today, and she was captain of the hockey team. After she left university, she went to London and was a journalist for a while on the old newspaper, the News Chronicle, and then came back to Leeds and became a very, very much loved teacher for the rest of her working life. She had a major stroke when she was 68. Now, I know strokes can be a predictor for vascular dementia, but made a wonderful recovery and was very fit for many years thereafter. Here she is in her 80s on Caldy Island in Tenby, South Wales. She could walk 5 miles at the age of 80 without even thinking about it. She was really fit and looked younger than her age. And quite honestly, I think that was key at the marriage. I think the registrars did not pick up on the massive age difference. At the time of the marriage, he was 67, she was nearly 92. Here she is diving into a swimming pool, age 89. She had dementia by then, but she could still dive, she could still swim. Her body never forgot how to do those. And we just took it for granted. We've all inherited her love of swimming. We took my granddaughter swimming for the first time this weekend and she loved it. So we all swim. And here is my mum, again in her late 80s. You can see she does not look that age, making a sandcastle on one of her favourite beaches. And I'll come back to that sandcastle later on in the talk. So in 2004, both my parents made their wills. They were common, straightforward wills, leaving everything, their house, their money, their possessions, to their 2 children. That will be me in Leeds, and I was now living next door to my mum. We bought the old family home in the year 2000, which was in a Leeds suburb, and my parents had a house built in the garden, so we lived next door. We were very, very close family. We were in the same drama group for years and years, I would write a play, mum would direct it, that kind of thing. And we always went on holiday together. I can't emphasize it enough. We're a really close family, and we lived close too. There was no fence between the two houses. Mum lived across our lawn. So they made their wills. In England and Wales, though not in Scotland and not in many other countries, marriage revokes a will as though it had never existed. So if you make a will and then you marry, your will is gone. I'm sure Andrew will be able to say more about that. I got so fed up, though, of people saying after mum's death, oh, your mother died intestate. No, she didn't. She made a proper will in 2004, like we're all told to do. At the same time as making a will, my mother set up enduring power of attorney so I could look after her affairs if she lost mental capacity to do so. To many people's surprise, power of attorney has no link with marriage. There's no requirement to tell the attorney if the donor plans to marry. One of the many forms of abuse I've had on social media, and this, by the way, is why many other cases won't speak up, is people absolutely yelling at me, you stupid woman, why didn't you get power of attorney? That would have stopped it. And I've had quite educated people saying that to me as well, including some of the doctors I work with. But there is no link. So, and it doesn't matter if you have the old-fashioned enduring power of attorney or the newer lasting power of attorney, there is no link with marriage. So there was no requirement to tell the attorney, that will be me, if the donor, that will be my mother, plans to marry. Here is my mother by the garden gate, and this is exactly where we think Mum met Ranlin. She'd been formally diagnosed with vascular dementia earlier that year. The first we knew of him were his things were all over the house, and quite valuable things such as an iPad. Mum didn't know who he was. She kept saying, where did he come from? Where does he live? And after a while I would say, I think he lives with you, Mum. Does he? What's his name? She never knew his name. If she called him anything, it was Lado, because that was her name for some man whose name you don't know. As her dementia got worse, she would then say, oh, there are people about, she would say vaguely, but she did not know who he was. And for her, it was not a romantic relationship. If anything, she thought he was some kind of carer. She kept saying, did you get him for me? And later on, that absolutely broke my heart. We asked some police earlier on if there was anything we could do about this, and we're told, oh, he's there at your mum's invitation. So there's nothing you can do. That, I'm sure, is not really accurate, but we just took their word for it and thought, okay, we'll just monitor the situation. We lived next door. I have to emphasize that. We saw her several times a day. It wasn't that we visited, it was that we just ran in and out of each other's houses. And in my mum's case, she would run. I would see her running across from her house to ours. And I'd say, what's the matter, Mum? And she'd say, oh, nothing. I just like running. That's how she was. We monitored the situation, which we thought at the time was all that we could do. And Mum's 90th birthday came around. By now, she'd been diagnosed with cancer and had chemotherapy, which is why her hair looks a bit different. That's with a younger looking me in April 2014. Her eyes look a bit blank there because she didn't have a clue what was going on. She knew it was a party and she loved a party. And for dementia, that is what counts. This moment now, being happy in this moment now is what counts. She was asked at that party, how old do you think you are, Joan? And she looked very puzzled and said, oh, am I 70? She had no clue. That was when she was 90. 18 months, no, nearly 2 years later, she got married. So for me, her cognitive abilities were long gone even by then. Meanwhile, we had been getting more and more worried about the man who did not want us to go upstairs in the house. And it's hard to say how he stopped us, really, but he has a very forceful personality and he would just not want us to go and look round. But one day we took Mum out and we came back and he wasn't there. And my brother, who lives in Amsterdam, but came over very often during this time, rushed upstairs to see what was happening. And my mum's bedroom, which had been a very sweet little, tidy little old lady bedroom, now looked like this. And it absolutely freaked us out. You can still see the pictures she had on the wall in the background, but he was a hoarder and bought jackets off the internet at the rate of about 3 a week. And this is what had happened to her bedroom. He'd moved her into a much smaller room. So before my mother died, we went for help. We went to my mother's GP. They didn't know what to do and suggested we call social services. Well, I'd already thought of that. I wish they had rung social services. Some joined up safeguarding would have really helped. We went to social services, who were very helpful, but they've got no right of entry. And actually they rang me afterwards and said, oh no, nothing to worry about, no safeguarding concerns. They could see she was clean, they could say she was they could see she was well fed. I must say, I am not blaming any group of people in this, because everybody had problems in dealing with it. I'm not blaming the social services, and I'm certainly not blaming the registrars. We went to the police. Unfortunately, we hit on a very old-fashioned policeman who just wrote it all down and then looked up at me and said, haha, people will say you just don't like him. The reason we went to the police, the trigger for it, or reason we went to the police again, was we went over to visit my mum one night, and as we were leaving, she said, did I say what you wanted me to say? And I found that so distressing. I went to the police, but I could tell they were going to take it no further. Then we went to the family solicitor. We didn't know in those days we needed a specialist solicitor like Andrew, who's here today. The family solicitor knew her dementia, had seen her with dementia, and said she won't be able to marry or to make a new will because of her dementia. Unfortunately, that was false reassurance, because what that lady didn't know was two things, really. She didn't know what she didn't know, and she didn't know that there is so little safeguarding at marriage. After my mother's death, the pathologist was not happy because she died at home, and they found out about this secret marriage. So the pathologist asked for a full forensic post-mortem. So we went in the space of a week from oh my goodness, don't be silly, dear, you're making a fuss about nothing, don't worry about it, to, oh, he might have murdered her. Now, actually, I never thought he had murdered her because he didn't need to. He'd married her. He just had to wait. We contacted the register office for the district where they married, and they really just said everything was fine. No, she was fine on the day. Totally compos mentis was the phrase. I said she really wasn't, because she had a 5-year history of dementia. And then I said, look, did it not strike you as odd that a 67-year-old man was marrying a 91-year-old lady with no family or friends present? And the lady who rang me said, oh, no, well, we can't judge, in that tone. And the trouble is, it is their job to judge, the registrars, but they are not trained in mental capacity, and they are not trained in safeguarding. At the moment, this is changing. We then went to the Office of the Public Guardian, who deal with power of attorney, and they said there's no link between power of attorney and marriage. And they were really sort of, oh my goodness, we've never heard of this before. So they were as a complete loss. We went to the local government ombudsman, who was actually really horrible to me. I said, look, she said, I can't look into it because there's nothing to investigate. There's no evidence kept at marriage. And I said, look, my mum was unfit to marry because of her dementia. And she said, well, so you say. And I just got off the phone, and it was heartbreaking. Then we went to the police, and this time they were a lot more helpful. The first policeman we spoke to said, oh no, it's a civil offence, because it had only become a criminal offence since 2014. I knew purely from my work that forced marriage, that if you marry someone who does not understand, it is forced marriage, and it is a criminal offence since 2014. The police then, I asked them, ring the forced marriage unit, because they'll tell you. And to do him credit, that young policeman did. He rang the first forced marriage unit and then rang me straight back and said, you're right, we were wrong. It's a criminal offence. We need to investigate. Then they built a case and put it to the Crown Prosecution Service. But They were working with no evidence. Why? No evidence is kept at marriage. There's no audio recording. There's no video recording. It's not like when you ring your bank. Although we have a letter from the registrars, which was sent to the man's solicitor, saying she couldn't answer some of the questions on the day. One of them raised that as a problem and said, are you sure she's fit to marry? But the other one went, oh, she's smiling. I'm sure she understands. And they just went right ahead with the ceremony. We then went to the forced marriage unit ourselves. They have always been really helpful. And actually, Rachel and I are working with them now, and we're hoping to devise some training for registrars. We then went to the General Register Office, the National Headquarters, who were very, no, everything was fine. She was fine on the day. And then I got a secret phone call from someone who said, this is happening all the time and up and down the land, and I'm not really supposed to talk about it. And at that point, we set up a website, and then we started hearing from other cases. And finally, we went to our MP, Fabian Hamilton, who I'm pleased to say is here today and has worked for us brilliantly over the past few years. So Fabian said, I'll raise it in Parliament. And he did in the Marriage and Civil Partnership Consent Bill on November the 21st, 2018. There we are with Fabian on that date. And it was passed unanimously for a second reading, but then ran out of parliamentary time, as private members' bills often do. But Fabian has not given up on us. And in fact, as he will tell you, asked another question in Parliament just this week. The Crown Prosecution Service came back saying they were unable to prosecute because of lack of evidence. There were no audio recordings or video recordings kept at marriage. And because of that, there have been no prosecutions for forced marriage with dementia. And I don't think there will be until something changes there. And for that reason, we're working very hard to try and build up the safeguarding at marriage. Changes we seek, that a marriage should no longer revoke a will. It doesn't do so in Scotland or France or the Netherlands or Canada or many of the provinces of Canada. And actually in the places that have changed the law, so marriage doesn't revoke a will, there is no big clamour to bring it back. We want robust procedures for registrars with accountability if these are not followed, including a standardised list of questions at marriage. And it does look now as if those are going to be brought in. At the moment, it's very hard for registrars to stop a wedding. They have been threatened. I've spoken to a lot of registrars. They've been threatened with everything from being sued for the cost of the honeymoon to physical violence. They are not highly trained professionals. They are low-paid clerical officials who can be paid as low as £8.50 an hour. And as they have said to me, we are expected to assess capacity after a few minutes of meeting someone with no real tools to do it. So it's guesswork, and that is just absolutely wrong. We want a link between power of attorney and marriage. We want notification of civil marriage to be published on the internet. At the moment, it's up in every individual register office. So if you're worried that someone's planning to marry your elderly relative, what you have to do is visit every register office once a month, which is ridiculous. Putting it on the internet would be the old equivalent of putting it on the church door. And I think that they will bring that in. We want evidence to be kept at marriage so that predators can be prosecuted. Finally, what did Ranlin do? He insisted that my mother should be buried when she'd always wanted to be cremated. He kept all the money and possessions, and the possessions to me was the most important. Things like my wedding dress was in her house. My granddad's letters from the First World War. I left the house next door to ours on the night my mother died, and I have never been able to go back into it. He refused to leave the house. The spouse inherits the first 270,000 of the estate and all personal possessions. 6 months after my mother's death, he used my mother's blue badge to park and was caught and prosecuted and failed to pay the fine. And we found out about that because some court officials came to the house. And for some reason, that just made me feel slightly vindicated. I thought, oh, I know what he is now. And it's a crook. I don't think for him, it's all about the money, though. I think there's a lot about control in there. And he remarried in 2018 to another elderly lady who lives nearby. And I don't really want to talk much about that, but her grandson rang both Fabian and me to say that had happened. Finally, just a couple of pictures. That's my mother's grave. It's unmarked. Marriage gives the predator total control over the funeral. My mother's grave is the patch of grass in the middle. He hasn't put up a headstone. We're not allowed to do it because he owns the grave plot. That's in Otley Cemetery. And Otley is a very nice town, but it's somewhere with which my mum had no connection at all. Finally, to come back to the sand castle, that's what she wrote underneath. Joan was here, and I am not going to let her be forgotten. The changes that we want to make will protect others in her position, and I am not going to let her name be forgotten ever, and certainly not until these changes are in place. Lots of thanks. We have a huge, helpful coalition of people, some of whom are here today, who have been helping us, and I cannot tell you how much I appreciate their help. Thank you very much, and I'm very happy to take any questions or any comments. I'm aware that I couldn't cover some of that in that talk, but I'm happy to mop up anything you would like to ask afterwards. I'll stop sharing my screen now. Thank you.
Wow. I knew the outline of your mother's case, Daphne, but I didn't know some of the detail. And I'm sure other people listening will probably feel as shocked as I now do in hearing the full detail of it, and impressed by your tenacity and your energy and those that have supported you to get you to today. And I hope that by us doing the webinar today, that you will have many more people being able to help influence the changes that are needed.
Thank you.
I'm trying to gather myself. I'm sure you've had to gather yourself many, many times, so I will put myself above that. Have anybody on the panel got anything they'd like to add to what Daphne has said, or should we do that through the questions? I haven't got any questions. There are some people coming through, Daphne, saying how powerful your presentation was, which I support that view. I'm sure you can see those for yourself. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Shall we move on to the questions we've already received? And as time goes on, I'm sure more thoughts will come up and people will have more they'd like to say. The first question that I have in front of me is about the law. And the question is, why hasn't the law in England, Northern Ireland and Wales changed so that marriage no longer revokes a will? I'll ask Andrew and then Fabian, and then we'll talk to Daphne after that. So Andrew, would you like to give us your thoughts on that, please?
Yeah, no problem. So the crux of the issue we have is the Wills Act, and it's from 1837, and that creates the provision under Section 18 where marriage revokes the will, and that creates the incentive that Daphne was talking about. So that's at the heart of the reform. And I think the main problem we have is, whilst no one can really disagree that this needs to be remedied, because it's legislation, it needs to go through Parliament in terms of any amendments or revocation of those provisions. And I think the problem we've had really is the procedure in Parliament. And it was, as Daphne said, it was first introduced in around 2018, and it fell away, I think, simply due to lack of parliamentary time rather than an appetite or lack of to reform it. So I think really it's a procedural issue in Parliament to get the bill passed and on the statute books, because it is legislation. And I think the last few years we've gathered momentum. The phrase predatory marriage is in the population, it's sort of in the media as well. But we need to get Parliament on board. And I think, again, there is general consensus to amend the legislation. We just have to try and get the procedure and the paperwork done. I think that the last few years, particularly, the problems have been first Brexit, and then when we were sort of nearly done with that, we had COVID, and no doubt the major atrocities in Ukraine are obviously focusing Parliament's time as well. So it's really just trying to get this seen as a real issue that Parliament needs to deal with. So again, anyone that wants to be involved, I think Daphne, myself, Fabian are really happy to listen, present, and raise some understanding and interest to get this topic known about and the reform implemented. And I think Fabian might be able to comment a little bit further about the ins and outs of the parliamentary process.
Okay, before we do so, there's a comment from Scotland. I live in Scotland, and while predatory marriage doesn't revoke a will, the marriage means the spouse has levels of control as next of kin. Is there a difference between us? So what do you know what that is? Can you explain that to people, please?
Yes, I'm not too familiar with the Scottish legal aspect, but I think that the benefit of the Scottish law is that it removes that incentive to abuse, because ultimately, if a will has to be put in place to benefit, which is typically what people or the criminals see as the way to benefit, well, you've got to go to solicitors normally, and you've got to go through a little safeguarding procedure there. So I think the major benefit of the jurisdictions where sort of the Wills Act doesn't apply is that the incentive is removed. But I think the problem in any jurisdiction which allows a predatory spouse some control is that you're faced with issues such as burial rights, where burial takes place, control of sentimental items. So it's not necessarily about the money. It's really the most important thing to families can be the sentimental items, the funeral arrangements. And if the spouse who controls the funeral says, I want it done here, it's very difficult to challenge that. And that can be the most upsetting part to families. And as Daphne said, her mother's in an unmarked grave, which sort of proves how sinister this can become.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, Fabian, would you like to add some views to that, please?
Well, Caroline, sorry, forgive me. I have prepared a short presentation, sort of six or 7 minutes, which outlines the work that I've done and answers many of those questions. I don't know if you want me to give that or just simply the question. I mean, obviously, firstly, just thank you to you and to everyone for being here today to discuss what I think is a really important issue for very many families, too many families across the country. Listening to Daphne's talk, which I've heard a few times, it never fails to move me, and it's deeply, deeply distressing, which is exactly what I thought when she first came to see me. Obviously, I want to thank Hourglass for arranging today. I think a rather stark statistic that you, Hourglass, have made clear is that 1 in 6 older people are the victims of abuse, in today's society. Now, some of those, of course, may be victims of predatory marriage. And I think that's why I fully support Hourglass in its mission to end the harm, abuse and exploitation of older people in our country. Now, since I raised my constituents, and that was Joan and Daphne Franks at the time, since I raised their experience directly with the Prime Minister in June of last year, I think it's become clear that theirs was not an isolated case, as Daphne's made very clear in her presentation. Now, I've since that question in Parliament, I've been contacted by hundreds of people who've either been directly affected by predatory marriage or were simply saying, thank you for raising it in Parliament, because they knew someone who had been affected. Now, my office and I have been told some really shocking stories about how others have suffered as a result of this appalling exploitation, where secret burials or cremations and private marriage ceremonies are commonplace, as Daphne outlined. Now, when I first met her at one of my advice surgeries, as she mentions, that was in 2018, I was absolutely horrified that such a disturbing situation was even possible in modern Britain. But clearly it's one which showed that our marriage laws are in urgent need of reform. And that's what inspired me to bring the bill to Parliament in an attempt to right such an historic wrong. Now, as many of you may have heard, the bill had wide-ranging support from across the House, with Labour, Conservative, SNP and Liberal Democrat MPs and the Green MP showing their support for it in the House of Commons. And we've also had a great deal of support in the House of Lords, Caroline. I have secured the support of Labour's front bench team, including the Shadow Justice Secretary, Steve Reed, and Labour will support the government if it introduces legislation to end predatory marriage. But I think tragically for so many families across Britain, the government continues to drag its feet. Now, there are reasons for that, as Andrew has outlined in his contribution. I think the first thing I should say is this is a real cross-party issue. And it shocked the whole House when I raised Daphne's story as part of my 10-minute rule bill presentation in 2018. And of course, at Prime Minister's Questions last year. I mean, Boris Johnson gave a very sympathetic response. And I won't rest until the government looks at the changes in the law in my bill again and realises that the trauma that Daphne and her family and so many other families have gone through as a result of predatory marriage is a matter which requires urgent reform. And I think it's vital that we as MPs, as elected representatives of the public, ensure that more families do not have to suffer the pain and anguish experienced by Daphne ever again. And I think that's why, together with Andrew from Shoosmiths, the legal firm which is who are assisting us, Daphne and I recently delivered a legal and political proposal to the Ministry of Justice after I met last year with the Justice Minister, Lord Wolfson, and the Deputy Registrar General to urge them and the government to take these changes forward into law, particularly, as we've mentioned this morning, the changes that must be made to the Wills Act to prevent marriage automatically revoking a previous will. Now, with the excellent assistance and advice I've had from Shoosmiths, the political and legal submission was handed in just before Christmas last year, and the recommendations that we're calling for in the proposal are very clear. First, and Daphne's said many of these already, the government needs to ensure that marriage no longer revokes a previous will in any circumstances. And I think a more rigorous and detailed training programme for registrars, and Daphne outlined the role of registrars and the fact that they aren't professionals on big salaries, should be created to identify whether a person has the mental capacity in the first place to enter into a marriage contract before the ceremony takes place. Now, I think there also needs to be a requirement for registrars to ensure that both parties in a marriage are aware of what they're doing. For example, Joan's consent was simply assumed as she was said to be smiling at the private ceremony. Well, that's clearly not good enough. And I think we must also modernise, as Daphne said, the way marriage registration procedures are carried out. I'm proposing a simple questionnaire to alert registrars as to whether a mental capacity assessment should be required in advance. And finally, of course, the notice of marriage, again, as Daphne said, should also now be published online so that families and people with the power of attorney may discover much sooner that a marriage is about to take place. I think there's no excuse for the current lack of transparency behind marriage notices. And finally, as Daphne said, a link between lasting power of attorney and the marriage legislation should be made. Now, this week in Justice Questions, I raised on the floor of the House of Commons once again, after the Justice Minister replied to my proposal, saying that he's waiting for the Law Commission's review of weddings to be completed before his department can review wills. So that answers the point I think that Andrew was making. And my view is that this is taking far too long, given that the elderly and vulnerable are still being targeted every single day. So I urge the Secretary of State to finally step in and support the legislative changes set out in our proposals so that we can bring this appalling abuse to an end. Now, with the weddings review expected to be completed in July, I will be meeting with the Minister again very soon, and I saw him yesterday to discuss how we can speed up the process of protecting our vulnerable. Now, whilst I'm confident, Caroline, that our campaign will ultimately be successful in ending exploitation, I think we need still more help. So I urge everyone here today, everyone who's listening, and anyone who knows of someone who's been impacted by this cruel exploitation to write to their own Member of Parliament and urge him or her to back the campaign. Specifically, ask the MP to write to the Ministry of Justice to make clear that marriage must never revoke a previous will. I think it's in the government's gift to make this change and make it soon. However, the issue not only needs reform on the national level, but on the local level too. So I therefore ask and urge everyone to contact their local councillor as well and ask them to write to the local authority's adult social care chief executive, as well as the councillor who chairs the relevant committee, to point out that more training needs to be put into place to ensure registrars are able to spot exploitation before it's allowed to happen. We are, Caroline, so close to getting these changes made and to bringing this exploitation of some of the most vulnerable in our communities to an end. And I'm delighted that the campaign has had so much interest from across the country and the media in the last few months. And I'm very grateful to Hourglass, to Andrew, for organising and arranging our important discussion today, and for all the help we've had from Andrew and Shoosmiths, and of course our dear Daphne, who really has been the driving force behind this campaign. If we garner enough support across Parliament and local government, I think we can finally remove the incentive from the unscrupulous people who choose to exploit our loved ones. Thank you, all of you, for taking part in this discussion today. I'm looking forward to any further questions, Caroline. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fabian. Daphne, is there anything else you want to add to that? There are a couple of questions that people have asked.
I'd just like to add that I had a meeting with Peter Farr, who is the head of wills, and they were talking about bringing in a proposal where marriage would not revoke a will, and you will probably know more about this than I do, Andrew, if somebody has capacity to marry, but not the higher level of capacity needed to make a will. And I said to him at the time, I have no idea how you would set about proving that in court. My mum had a 5-year history of dementia all through her medical records, and yet we couldn't prove that she didn't make a miracle recovery on the day because they keep no evidence at marriage. And the other thing is the Law Commission did do a survey into wills, which, as Fabian just said now, was paused to do another survey into marriage, which anyone could complete, but I bet none of you knew about it because it was right in the middle of the pandemic.
Yes.
So they paused the wills survey, but it means that the information coming in with the wills survey, which they will finally get round to acting upon, closed in 2017. That's a good few years ago now.
It is a bit.
So their wheels grind slowly, and meanwhile 900,000 people or so have dementia, and the numbers are set to double. So yeah, it's appalling. But again, I'd like to repeat my thanks to Fabian for never letting go of this issue.
Absolutely. We have a couple of questions on in the question and answer section. Somebody's asked, would a forced marriage protection order cover this type of situation?
Yeah.
Andrew?
Yeah, so there's, I think it was before Christmas or very recently, there was a case in the Court of Protection called Re-BU, which was sort of a case on point really, and sort of gives anyone that's questioning if this abuse takes place some evidence that it does. In that case, I understand that the Court of Protection, who sort of really make decisions on behalf of the sort of incapacitated or the vulnerable people, sort of had a case which was brought to them, and it was one of those ones which was pretty blatant, and the court made a pretty sort of direct judgment about the findings, and it found that this vulnerable person still had capacity, but they were subject to coercive control to the extent that really the court couldn't trust that if a marriage took place, it would be proper. So in that case, they did make that type of marriage order. It was time limited, I think, to about a year, and the court would then review the position. But in reality, what the court said was no marriage should take place between the protected party and this alleged relationship that she was in, because they didn't feel it was a marriage which would be proper. So that is an example of where the court protection can make orders protecting the vulnerable from predatory marriages, but those cases can only really help someone, if they've got the evidence, and it can be extremely difficult to get that type of evidence unless it's pretty blatant, and it's a very rare judgment. Secondly, someone's got to fund the case to the Court of Protection, and that's not inexpensive. And also it's very distressing for anyone who has to sort of see lawyers and issue court proceedings to protect their loved ones. So I think it echoes the point that whilst during life there is some remedies here, one, they are expensive, impractical, and many marriages take place in secret. So you sort of in a very difficult position as a family member. I think just to echo the points made, the reform we've got to implement has to be practical. It has to stop the incentive. It has to remedy it before it even happens, because you don't want to have to see lawyers after the event or even during life to sort these problems out. So I think that's the key point. So there certainly is things to do during life. See lawyers that specialise in the area. There's very small things you can do after the loved one's passed away. But these things, whilst they exist, are not, from my experience, the answer to this. And I would also point out that in terms of anyone's concern that the sort of legitimate spouses are being affected by this law reform, what's important to know is the Inheritance Act, which is sort of from the 1970s, allows the court to change the rules of intestacy or a valid will to make provision for a legitimate party or spouse. So, ultimately, anyone that is marrying for the proper reasons and a genuine relationship will always be protected and have rights. So really, this reform is only targeting those which are taking advantage of people who, need society's protection. And whilst we always talk about incapacity to marry and people with dementia and Alzheimer's, the point to also note is the law in this area also applies when there's mistake or duress. So if your loved one's under duress when they marry and they pass away, you're in the same situation as Daphne. even if you have conclusive evidence about the marriage being subject to lack of capacity, duress, or even mistake. So it's sort of a far-ranging concept, and also, it's not just the rich or sort of those people in society. This can affect anyone at any level, really, because ultimately a modest property nowadays could well be worth 200,000 or more. So it could happen to everyone, and definitely points out, really, as we all age, we could find ourselves a victim of this unless something is done to prevent the problem.
Thank you. Really detailed and useful response. Thank you for that, Andrew. Another question is, somebody has identified that the forced marriage protection order under the Family Act 96 can result in a sentence of up to 5 years in prison. So hopefully quite a strong deterrent. It feels like it hasn't been a deterrent.
It hasn't, and I would say that also it is still a criminal offence to sort of marry someone against their will or when they lack capacity, and that wasn't any disincentive in the situations we see now in the inquiries myself, Daphne, and Fabian have had. So I think whilst it is on the sort of the criminal statute books as an offence, there is also no civil redress about the rights to sentimental items, burial rights and things like that, and where the inheritance goes. So I think there is no argument to say there is things to disincentivise the abuse. There is some things, but the problem you've got, whilst marriage revokes a will, if that takes place in secret abroad where there's no records being kept, and then the person passes away, well, you've got no evidence for the CPS to prosecute. So, we're talking about people who take advantage of people, and I don't think they're going to be deterred by that. But if the court protections called them out and found, made that type of order, then I would suggest probably they're unlikely to marry in that situation. But we're talking about the vast majority of people who really have never had the opportunity to even know about the marriage to prevent it or seek court orders.
I think also, may I intervene, Karen?
Yeah, of course.
I mean, two things here. It seems to me that one of the main incentive, not the only incentive, but the main incentive for the unscrupulous individuals who do pursue predatory marriage is the prospect of the automatic inheritance, the revocation of previous wills. And I think once the law on that is changed, it won't get rid of predatory marriage, but it will considerably reduce the incentives for the unscrupulous. The second, I think, is to emphasize again that the government is waiting on the Law Commission. And what I can't understand, and I will quiz the minister on, Tom Pursglove, who is arranging to see me in the next few weeks about this, following my question on Tuesday. The thing I can't understand is why the government isn't dictating the agenda here. I understand the importance of the Law Commission, Andrew, but why is it that they're simply bowing to the Law Commission's view that they can't do anything on wills until the laws on marriage are finally agreed upon? So that just doesn't seem to make sense. Hopefully I might get an explanation from the minister when I meet him eventually.
Agreed.
Okay, thank you. One of the things we talked about when there were technical difficulties was about the number of resources that are available to help people understand both the legislative framework that currently exists and some of the cases around and some of the practical ways in which people can manage this situation. And Andrew, you said you had a document which we would be able to share and send out to people.
So there's a very detailed article for anyone that really wants to sort of understand the concept and try and rack their brains as to whether we're missing something on the law. But I think rest assured there is nothing that can be done to fix the problems easily in this, unless this reform comes about. So that article will be sent around, which sort of details the law. But in essence, it is that Wills Act which causes the problem. And also it may be interesting for people to note that even if you are fortunate enough to set aside a dodgy marriage during life, it still revokes a valid will. So an invalid marriage revokes a valid will. So you need to put another will in place, even if you challenge a marriage that should never have taken place. That's the predatory marriage trap. And obviously, if someone's lost capacity, it's then difficult to make a will quickly and cheaply. You need to ask a judge to make the will. So you can see where you're talking about, if it's a modest estate, families have put out the justice system. So I think that's important. But I would say, in terms of anyone during life which has real concern about family members, one, keep an eye on them. Two, get proper legal advice, because there is the court of protection which can help people. You can also potentially look at entering a marriage caveat which blocks a marriage taking place. And as I say, if the marriage takes place, whether it's valid or not, the damage is done. So I think the caveat system is very, very useful. But really, that's the extent of what people can do quickly and easily. But ultimately, after the loved one's passed away, the marriage you cannot challenge because it's classified as voidable from the legal point of view. And you're then only in a situation where you've got to try and make an Inheritance Act claim of your own, which allows certain family members to claim provision for their maintenance needs. But, if you're relatively self-sufficient and got some private wealth, you're going to find it extremely difficult to try and undo those rules of intestacy and ask the court to change the position. So, it's prompt action during life that you've got to do, which means ultimately keeping an eye on your elderly relatives and taking advice when you can.
Yeah.
Okay.
Could I just come in to say that Ray BU case, which I put the name of in the chat, was the first case I've ever known where the relatives got anywhere. Normally, if the relatives go to court, they lose. Marriage trumps everything. We actually went to court on the strong advice of a solicitor, not Shoosmiths, because they said just for the funeral. That's all we wanted, the funeral. And so we went to court and we were very much reassured all the way along. As soon as the judge can see the marriage is dodgy, which it clearly was, then he'll give the funeral to you, because that was one of the criteria, the wishes of the family and friends. Actually, to the surprise of all and the horror of our family, the judge summed up by saying he thought it was very unlikely that Mum had capacity to marry. However, it was not his job to sort out that problem in this case. The man was her legal husband. He thought the man loved her. The man is very plausible, I have to say, and a lot of these predators are. He thought the man loved her. He gave him the funeral. We had to pay all the costs. The costs were 200 grand. So believe me, I would advise any family, do not go to court. You will lose. The forced marriage protection order and the caveat is a very good idea. I do know of one case in Northern Ireland where a solicitor actually wrote to the registrar saying, please don't go ahead with this. In that case, the father had been sort of kidnapped, as the family put it, and taken to another part of the country. And the family had said, please, the solicitor wrote, please don't go ahead with this because the man has dementia and is not fit to marry. The registrars went ahead because they said, oh, your father presented very well on the day. They are not trained in assessing capacity. So it needs to be done legally, but anything legal costs an absolute shed load of money. And it's not fair to put that burden on the families, especially when the families have just lost a loved one. The man constantly argued, oh, Daphne doesn't love her mother. And that was heartbreaking for me, but it almost seemed to carry some weight with the authorities. Somebody has asked in the questions about, did my GP go to anyone else?
Yep.
No, they didn't. I actually asked them, please, would you have a practice meeting to discuss this? And they did do that, but all they came up with is you should ring social services. I would really like joined up safeguarding. If they had rung social services, it would have carried more weight. But again, they're not trained. They're not trained in that aspect. I work on a medical course, and I know that they have very limited safeguarding training, and certainly not to deal with anything like that. But I would like safeguarding professionals to talk to each other. And on that note, I've had a meeting very recently with Norel Hack, who is one of the joint heads of the forced marriage unit, because this is forced marriage and punishable with up to 7 years in jail. But there has never been a prosecution for forced marriage with dementia, as far as I know, because no evidence is kept at marriage, so it can never be proved. What would have had to have been proved in our case was, did Mum lack capacity at the time of the marriage? And there's no evidence to say if she did or she didn't, apart from the letter from the registrars. And did the man know it? And this is why I would suggest the man has always denied that she had dementia at all. And in court to the judge, he said, she didn't have dementia. She was just my Joan. And the judge believed him. So the families are in a terrible situation, and I don't want the families and the victims, I don't want it to be down to them to have to prove it.
No.
I'd really like it to be down to the predator to prove that she did have capacity.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you for that. I think we've covered some of the other questions in some of the presentations and points that have already been made, but I'm going to quickly go through them just to make sure, to see if any of you've got anything extra you'd like to add to the debate. So the next question that we had earlier was, why are people wrong in assuming an LPA, a lasting power of attorney, prevents predatory marriage? So I think people do make that assumption in the same way as they make assumptions about a lot of other things around marriage. And Andrew, are you able to?
Yes, I think the
answer that?
Daphne's probably touched on that, but it's the simple point there is that there's no reporting requirement. There's no links between the relevant authorities. So ultimately, if you've got attorneyship over a vulnerable person, you will not get a letter from anyone saying this person's about to marry. As Daphne said, you need to visit the registries and find out for yourself, which is impractical. So that is the problem. And as I've said before, the problem with this concept is that once the marriage takes place, the damage is really done. You have to then unwind the whole thing. So, ultimately, if you do have a attorneyship and find out, you might be able to remedy things at great expense and after significant periods of time. Or, as I said before, ultimately, if you're not ever notified, because you won't be notified and you never find out because it's happened in secret or abroad, you won't find out until the loved one's passed away, and then you're too late to change anything because you have no standing to undo a marriage after one party has died. So that is the predatory marriage trap people find themselves in. And then you add to that all the wrongful assumptions made by both other professionals and the public about the situation, because quite honestly, people think, and quite logically, really, this can't happen, shouldn't happen. And it seems far-fetched to say it does. And therefore people assume that you will have remedies in the situation, and you really don't, as Sir Daphne's pointed out. So that is the problem, but there's a very quick, easy fix to a lot of this, and it's removing incentives, it's linking the obvious together, and really prevention is better than cure, which is why the safeguarding is so important. But then at the end of the day, we need the law to be changed to have rights of action so that families do have an ultimate redress to this if they need to take something to court. But that is the last resort. But I think it needs to be there to allow things to change, really. So yeah, don't ever make that assumption. Unfortunately, it's probably the most dangerous one you could make.
Yeah, yes, that's true. You become too reliant on something that isn't going to help you at all. So Daphne or Fabian, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Let me chip in here, Caroline. I mean, 2 points. I mean, firstly, obviously it's down to me as the member of the legislature to pursue that. I mean, both Andrew and Daphne have emphasised over and over again, the law needs to be changed. That's where I come in. That's what we're pursuing, and we're not going to give up on this. I think the second is a point that, again, both of you have made very emphatically. There is no joined up thinking. And this is what absolutely makes me so angry about the way government, doesn't matter, I'm not talking about politics here, I'm talking about government runs, is that in this country, we do not have connected organisations. And the best example of that is, of course, lasting power of attorney. Why is it not the case that somebody who's given lasting power of attorney to their relatives or whoever it may be, why is that not connected with their capacity, for example, to marry or to make a will or to make decisions for themselves? That's why they've done it in the first place. It seems insane to me. And just a final thought, I wonder whether there's anything to learn from the way other countries do this, and not least Scotland, where the situation is different because they have a different legal system. But why don't we look at, I know we hate to look at France or anywhere in Europe these days, but what do other European countries do? And how do they tackle this same issue? Do they suffer in the same way? Or have they got remedies and solutions that we don't have to reinvent? We can simply look at their experience and copy from that.
Brilliant, thank you. Somebody has talked about the vulnerable persons register. Would that be helpful? I don't know what that, does people know what that is?
I don't know.
No, nor do I. I'll say to the person that wrote it, Tina, thank you for your question. We will come back to you when we send out the link to the recording and be able to answer you on that once we've pursue that a bit for ourselves. Daphne?
My guess is that there is no link, because registrars have no link with anything at marriage. They absolutely, they don't have any link with medical records. They don't see anything. They literally, they are supposed to do separate interviews at the notification of marriage and again at the marriage itself, but they don't always do that because they don't understand the necessity for it, because they're not trained in safeguarding. Registrars are always being pushed for time. Do it quicker, do it quicker. And so the idea of taking some time out to actually talk to each person in different rooms, in the letter from the registrars, it actually says that the man tried to interrupt. He shouldn't have been able to interrupt when mum couldn't have answered a question, because he shouldn't have been in the same room. So registrars have no access to any other information other than what is standing in front of them. And I think in 2022, that's just appalling.
Agreed, which brings us brilliantly, Daphne, to our next question, which is about the nature of the training and assessments that are needed to be put in place for registrars. It is a small part of the resolution that you're seeking, but it's an important part. So particularly from a safeguarding perspective, what training, what vehicles, what resources need to be put in place for registrars to make that assessment more effective? And before anybody answers, there's a point made in the questions. Could registrars be given access to the OPG LPA register to check the status of people over a certain age? We might want to say everybody, because we may find ourselves in a discriminatory position, but or those who are younger that present with vulnerability. So I think if they looked for everybody, but can you include that in your answers to the point about what sort of training would be useful and what resources do they need to have to help prevent predatory marriage? Daphne?
The first thing is registrars are what they're supposed to do at the moment in the guidelines is, if one of them has doubts, they should pause the wedding for a capacity assessment. They don't always do that. They didn't in Mum's case. It's written down that one of them had doubts, but they don't. And the reasons for that are multifactorial. One of them is they're worried that if they ring the General Register Office for advice, which they're supposed to do, they'll get told, don't you know their job? Don't you know your job? Lots of registrars have said that to me. And they have also said they've been told it's a local issue. It's not, you know, it's a national issue. It's just appalling. So that's one reason. Though I have to say the General Register Office really, since Fabian's had some meetings with them, seems to have done a bit of a turnaround, which is fabulous, and is now talking about bringing in training for registrars. And I had a meeting recently with the Forced Marriage Unit, Norrell Hack, and they are going to be rolling out some training for registrars. And Rachel and I are hoping to be involved with this. Just by chance, my job is teaching doctors what to say. This is why I know that there's no point just putting in the handbook things like you should stop the wedding. They don't know what to say to do it. It's really hard to do with 30 people looking at you or whatever. So I want to train people in a form of words to say, and something like, unfortunately, because you have been able to answer this question, I have no alternative but to pause this wedding for a capacity assessment. I'm really sorry. Goodbye, and then get out of the room, because they are genuinely afraid. And that is what I would like to happen. So I know the head of the Forced Marriage Unit has said that he will talk to us, Rachel and me, and hopefully we will be able to come up with something. Until very recently, the General Register Office has said, it's all in the handbook, it's all in the handbook, but that is not enough. How doctors should work is all in the GMC handbook, but I have spent my career training them on what to say to break bad news, that kind of thing. And I feel it's a completely transferable thing, which is why I would really like to be involved in helping to put together some training materials and then train the trainers. Now, I have to say, in that meeting with Norrell Hack of the Forced Marriage Unit, he did say that if any registrars were not sure what to do, and they didn't want to ring the General Register Office, they could contact the Forced Marriage Unit. And he said that very explicitly. So I'm just passing that on here. It is so hard for the registrars, and that is why I've never blamed them. I have to say, I have never been able to stand up to this man. Every time I've tried, he's had me in tears. So I don't blame them. But at the same time, something needs to be done to stop this. So yeah, although Caroline, you said the safeguarding part is not the major part, it's the practical part.
Yeah.
And until we can get the law changed and those wheels grind very slowly, it is something we can start doing now,
Sure.
and we're going to start doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And clearly people who are listening will be able to do so in their own workplaces by the looks of their questions.
Caroline,
Fabian.
Laurie, sorry to interject here. Laurie Bush, I think, just said on the chat that it needs regulation, not guidelines. And I couldn't agree more with that.
I agree.
Just to back up what Daphne says, one of my relatives is actually an assistant a registrar in the south of England. And she says that she uses her own common sense to assess whether somebody has the capacity, but of course it isn't in the guidelines. It isn't regulated. She's not trained to do it. So she does it because she's aware of the problem, partly because she knows me and the work that we've been doing together. But, you know, it shouldn't have to work like that. And I have to say, it took nearly a year for us to get to the Deputy Registrar General, who actually listened, and I thank him hugely for his interest. But I contacted the Registrar General's office mistakenly, and I was completely rebuffed 3 times by 3 different Registrars General, saying we're not accountable to members of Parliament or Parliament itself. Well, if you're not accountable to Parliament, who are you accountable to? Because you're paid out of the public purse, you're public servants. So I found that really reprehensible. And it was only Lord Wolfson who actually changed that and said, that's not the person you need to talk to. It's actually the deputy who seems to do all the heavy lifting here. And the deputy was really helpful.
It might also be.
It has made a difference. It's really made a difference, Fabian. Thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry, Andrew.
That's right. Just from our experience, because we also deal with sort of will disputes which involve capacity and that, and sort of disputes about undue influence of that nature. You know, what we see is people presenting the sort of the testators, or in predatory marriage, the victim, is that often people have a social facade, and even solicitors miss these things when they meet clients and prepare wills they think are proper when they're not. Is ultimately someone can present very, very well to someone, but until you ask the right type of questions, you won't realise that they are, you know, under a disability or dementia or Alzheimer's. So I think that's the problem. People turn up and smile and look happy. No further questions are currently asked, and that is the social facade people present. So I think that is the main problem until there's proper guidelines or regulations. And also in terms of the draft reform we put together, we consulted Dr. James Warner on the capacity points and tried to prepare this checklist of yes or no responses and red flags, which mean you then have to defer to a medical expert for an opinion, because none of this is designed to stop marriages, really. It's just designed to prevent the vulnerable being taken advantage of, like in every other situation, really. So I think that's the approach, because I think it's, even for solicitors taking will instructions, it's very difficult to say to a client, sorry, I don't think you've got capacity, come back when you've seen your GP. It's really quite an awkward conversation. It's probably tenfold over when you're trying to marry, someone wants to marry and you're blocking that process, which they might find offensive. They'll complain about you, they'll risk suing you because you won't allow the marriage. So I think I can completely understand why it's so difficult for registrars to make that decision. I think in reality, unless there's change, registrars are only going to stop or prevent marriages when it's absolutely blatant, like the BB case, which, you know, if a predator's taken advantage of someone, you can probably bet 99% of the time they're going to do it in a way which is under the radar, because that's the point of the whole exercise. So
they're good. They're really good at it. They're very good.
But with all abusers in that way, One of the questions that came to my, or thoughts that came to my mind as you were talking about the registrars, is that the ability for a range of venues now to hold marriages possibly doesn't help this issue, because
It really doesn't.
It isn't in one building. So, you know, if you haven't got the confidence to challenge, or the wherewithal, the language, or the way, you know, the information to be able to say those questions, and you're on your own in a venue in some beautiful Surrey hills, you know, I mean, I think that's really difficult for people.
the marriage consultation, which had 92 questions, so wasn't really user-friendly, but part of it was suggesting, would it be all right to only have one registrar at marriage? And I said, no, it jolly well wouldn't. Why do you have two nurses at chemotherapy? One of them is a barrier. And the other thing was, is it all right if we make it so you can get married on a cruise ship or in someone's living room? That's all very lovely, but it wasn't written with a safeguarding head on at all. It would be can you imagine somebody trying to stop a marriage on a cruise ship, and yet you can completely understand a predator taking your mum away for a lovely cruise.
Yes,
and now we're
lovely.
married. I can totally see that.
Mm.
And in someone's living room, no. So you need far more robust safeguarding before any of this is brought in.
Agreed. Okay. We'll move to our final question now, which is, what else needs to be done to make sure predatory marriage is prevented? I think you've all made lots of really valid points about this. It's just, maybe this is our opportunity to start to bring those together as a final point through this question. So we've heard a lot of things that you have all said. I feel privileged that I've learned so much this morning, so thank you all. But is there anything else that you haven't said already that you think will help make sure predatory marriage is avoided?
Fabian said, put it as a requirement, not as a guideline, and that is absolutely true. I have made the parallel to the registrars with the GMC document, the General Medical Council for doctors, which I work with a lot, and that says you must do this, you must be honest and open, you must do this. The registrar's document, which I've seen, says you should do this, you should have separate interviews. They take that to mean if you're not too busy, or if you're not too pushed for time, or if, as one registrar said to me, the couple look dodgy. What does that mean? So it's a complete lack of knowledge of safeguarding. It really is, and that's what needs to be rectified.
Yeah, Fabian said earlier about what can we learn from elsewhere, and we have a comment from Canada in the points, which are why are interviews not carried out before the license is issued? In Canada, we had separate interviews. We had to declare that we were entering the marriage willingly. I'm sure there was more to it than that, but that's a synopsis of that. That's a fair point, and one that I think you've all made today.
It's supposed to happen here. It doesn't always happen. Registrars frequently admit, well, not happily, but they will admit it doesn't always happen. No. And they are always being pushed by the authorities, do it quicker. They are supposed to have separate interviews at the notification of marriage in a separate room for 3/4 of an hour. And then on the day of the marriage itself, they are again supposed to have separate interviews. But even when they do that, they often keep the couple in the same room, which is just not, it's just basic safeguarding. You know, then you need, and if you'd have spoken to my mum separately, you would have realized she could only say 3 sentences, and then she'd go, oh, the hole in my head, and burst into tears. So I know for a fact, because I saw her all the time and every day, she could not have done a 3/4 of an hour interview. They didn't do it.
No.
Yeah. Okay.
And also, I mean, I think, you know, you said, you were talking, Daphne, you didn't want this to be about the man who married your mother, but he was my constituent, and he approached me separately. And he approached me to say that I'd been libeling him in Parliament, and why had I hidden behind parliamentary privilege to say the things I'd said, so he couldn't sue me for saying them. In other words, he absolutely was convinced, he must have convinced himself and tried to convince everybody else that this was not in any way exploitative, and this was a marriage born out of genuine love. We know it wasn't, because we know from his actions what happened. And it's not, you know, I don't want to personalize this, but actually that is the case with very many others. They present a face that says, I'm doing this out of love and affection. It's absolutely genuine. I have nothing to gain from it. And it's plausible. And it's that plausibility, I think, that really puts registrars off guard, and others off guard, including the courts in Daphne's case, to think, well, this person is clearly genuine and loves the person that he or she is married.
Absolutely. It was ever thus in terms of how abuse presents, to be fair.
Yes. The predators are always very plausible and often quite charming. The families can be come over as slightly hysterical. I'm sure when I went to the police, I was saying things like, and he sold his house and he put all his stuff in our garage. And the more I tried to say things like that to try and make him believe me, the less he believed me. Yeah. So the families can come over as just slightly bonkers. But the predators are calm and plausible and charming. And I think that's something to really bear in mind.
And they've often practiced it many times before, I'm afraid to say.
Well, and go on to do so afterwards, as we've heard earlier.
Yeah.
A very valid point made by Laurie, which is about this needs to apply to civil partnerships as well, which we will need to pick up, I think, both as a charity and in terms of any campaigning. Andrew, did you have anything else you would want to add to what needs to be done to make sure predatory marriage is prevented?
I think it sort of probably covered also the legal points and the safeguarding points, but I think the key thing is that whilst it is a problem, I think people still need to take away that, you know, there is small things that can be done. So don't give up completely until reform's here. You know, do take advice, do look after your loved ones. You know, that's got to be remembered. And I think ultimately, you know, we need to push for this reform. And it is part of a wider concept of, you know, you've got predatory marriage, but you've also got predatory romantic relationships, which stop short of marriage, abuse of power of attorneys, dodgy lifetime transfers, people going down the old-fashioned route of actually trying to get wills made rather than marrying someone because they think that's easier when it's not. And you've got probate claims after a loved one died. So I think, you know, this reform is absolutely essential, but it's part of a wider topic of sort of elder abuse, which, you know, this jurisdiction is way behind other jurisdictions on the point, and it will get worse given the statistics about the rising, issue of people having more diagnosis of dementia, which I don't know what the statistic is. Daphne, you may know. It's sort of, is it over 1 million people with dementia in the next?
It's about 900,000, they think, but it's set to double in the next 20 years. So that's what I've heard at the medical school anyway. So I think that sounds pretty likely. I have heard the figure of 850,000 elsewhere. So it's somewhere around there.
Yeah, still a growing problem.
Well, act now, and don't regret later.
Absolutely. One of the things that we had hoped to achieve today was raising awareness of both the issue and indeed the campaigning and the work that needs to be done. And certainly people have been asking what they can do. And I think it would be helpful in our closing comments, which I'm going to ask you all to make a closing comment, to flag up for the people that are participating what they can do. Something that has been suggested is that Hourglass provides some template letters, and I'm sure we can work with all of you to do that, so that people can send their letters to their GPs. I think template letter, I don't know, it'd be interesting to hear from Fabian whether getting a template letter drives you nuts, or whether in fact you like them to be slightly more from the individual. That's a point I've always wanted to ask, actually, so I will take the opportunity later. So it may be helpful if we can finish off, each of you say what you think people who are listening and later on listen can do to help the work that you are doing on this issue. So Andrew, would start with you, please. I
think from my point of view, the biggest, not biggest pushback, but the biggest question I get asked by fellow professionals is how big a problem is this? Not saying it's not an important issue, but you know, is this 1 in a million, or is it under the radar and it's happening everywhere and we need to actually all get behind it? So I think, you know, anyone which has contacts that can help raise the issue, has any data or questionnaires that have been issued to people, or inquiry statistics about those problems, whether they're other professional lawyers or charities. I think if we have some objective data on this, I think it just help answer those repetitive questions about, you know, how many victims are there, because that seems to be a regular question asked by journalists. And we've got, data that's growing, but because it's technically not a civil issue or an offence, there isn't any statistics. There is forced marriage statistics, but that's the criminal offence, and it won't include predatory marriage necessarily. So I think, from my point of view, that would be incredibly helpful if anyone does have any data or contacts or sort of ideas in terms of actually trying to gather numbers. Because I think, as Daphne and Fabian have said, victims quite understandably don't want to come forward because it's private affairs and people don't want to sort of put their name to this. So that from my point of view would be quite helpful.
Okay, thank you. Fabian.
Thank you, Caroline. Well, in concluding, I'd emphasise two things. One is that once the law on wills is changed to stop a will being automatically changed on remarriage, that will take away much of the incentive for predators, not all of it, of course. So we need to pursue that, and I will certainly be doing that with colleagues and obviously with the help of Daphne and Andrew. I think the second thing about what can we do, yes, as I said, write to MPs as well. Write to your local MP and say, this is an issue that I have encountered personally, or a friend or close relative of mine has also encountered. It's very powerful. Now, on the question of template letters, to answer your question, Caroline, does drive us a bit mad. What far worse, actually, I have to say, are template emails, where it's a sort of clickbait type ones, where they're all the same. And we often get emails saying, dear insert name of MP here, I'd like to complain about, because I can't even be bothered to put the name of the MP in or find out who that is. Look, I think what you can do from Hourglass, which would be helpful, is have a checklist of the things that the individual constituent or complainant can actually mention in their correspondence. So they can put it in their own words, but they've got a checklist of things that need to be included in that. Yeah. And don't forget to put the name of your MP, not dear insert name of MP here. Yeah. And I think finally, local authorities do matter as well. So as I said in my brief contribution, do talk to your local social services, do ask your local councillor. And actually, in a way, councillors are more, or should be more, accessible than MPs, because they don't have to go to Parliament. They're in your locality all the time. They represent usually a quarter or a sixth of a parliamentary constituency. There's often 2 or 3 councillors per ward. And although many have to work as well, they are there all the time. They are around all the time. So do try and see your councillor if you're really concerned, and ask them to do something or take some action locally. That will have an important effect. But best of all, write to your MP, and if Hourglass can provide a checklist type template, that would be enormously valuable. We will continue this campaign. I won't give up till the law is changed. It really needs to be done, and we're going to carry on until we succeed.
Brilliant, thank you. And Daphne, I'd really love the last word to be yours, if that's something you would want to do.
Huge thanks to everyone for coming this morning. Thank you so much to Fabian and to Andrew and to Hourglass for inviting us. It's been really useful. And I've put my contact details in the chat. If anyone would like me to talk to their group or organisation, please do get in touch. Just for the avoidance of doubt, I don't charge for online talks. I'm just keen to spread awareness. And I'd like to thank everyone for coming. The chat, I know, on Zoom will disappear as soon as the meeting ends. So I don't know if it's possible to save it, but just pointing that out, that's happened before. Thank you very much indeed, everyone, for coming today. And thank you,
and
Caroline.
I'd like to thank you again, all 3 of you, for your role in this. It's been a fascinating and insightful, and not least very well, I'm shocked, I have to say, morning where I've learned so much. And as chair of Hourglass, I commit us to doing the things that we have already said that we would do, and I will speak to the CEO about that. Thank you, all 3 of you. I wish you well. Thank you for your time.